In this episode of the Art of Worldbuilding channel, we'll talk about travel over water. This means wooden ships and what is meant by tall and round ships, like those used by pirates, and other terms. We'll also figure out how to tell how long a trip would take using oars or the wind. All of the info is based on my book, Creating Places, which is Volume 2 in the Art of Worldbuilding book series, and is found in Chapter 8. As we get started, remember to click the like button and subscribe to see more videos. As for me, I'm the author of the most in-depth book series, a podcast, a blog, and courses at Worldbuilding University, which I founded. I have over 30 years of world-building advice, tips, and tricks for you. There are a number of things that impact sailing between two different locations, and one of those is the wind. The direction and strength of this can change. Some countries also build better ships that are more seaworthy, and they might have better sailors. All of this influences trade routes, which nations can conquer others, or how difficult it is for them to do so. With the wind, we have leeway for how long it takes to get from one place to another. This removes some pressure to get it right. If we have a map, we can also write "not drawn to scale" on it to help with this flexibility. If we have oarsmen, they are not going to be able to row at the same speed indefinitely, and their endurance and training is going to change from ship to ship. So one crew might be able to go faster than another. Of course, wind speed is not consistent, and then the wind direction is also not consistent. Both of these can affect the speed. Different types of ships also sail at different speeds under the same exact conditions. If you have a frigate that is chasing a ship of the line, it might be faster. Another thing is that ships are weighed down by the people who are on there. Some of those can be killed in combat, for example, and then there's the cargo, the amount of food, and of course the weapons and ammunition. At the start of a 5-month journey, the ship is going to be weighed down more so than at the end. So in theory, it's going to be traveling slower at the start. The ship can also be damaged. A storm might have caused this, such as breaking a mast or a yard. My favorite explanation for why we have some leeway is that our ship may be sailing on a fictitious planet with possibly a different number of moons and anything else that may affect the sea. This could be a kind of cheap excuse if we say that a frigate is sailing a certain number of miles and at a certain speed, and therefore it reaches its destination in a certain number of days. And someone else on Earth could say, hey, that's not possible. But we can always say, hey man, this is a fictional planet. You can't really say that. I am the god of this place. I say what really works here and what goes. Let's briefly cover a few ship terms so that we are all talking the same language. The only ones I'm going to cover here are the ones you need to understand in order to understand the differences between one type of ship and another, because we're going to be talking about that more later. The mast is the vertical pole you see in the middle of the ship. Some ships have none, and some only have one. Some have two, and some of them have three. In a few cases, there are actually 4 of these. Technically, there's even a ship with 5, which I believe is called a clipper ship. There are other terms for masts, like the center mast is obviously the one in the middle. The foremast is the one at the front of the ship, and the one at the back is often called the mizzen mast, but we'll just call that the rear mast to keep this easier. That mast is usually the shortest. The one in the middle is usually the tallest. If a ship only has 2 masts, the one in the back is the one that's usually not there. What's the point of a mast? Well, it's to hold the yards. Those are the horizontal bars that the sails are actually attached to. As it turns out, not all of the yards are horizontal, but most of them are. There's also an expression you may have heard, and that is that a ship is square-rigged. What this means is that if the ship is headed north to south and the yards are east to west, they are squared up with each other. That's what a square-rigged ship means. On the other hand, there's something known as a lateen-rigged ship. This means that the yard is sloped and runs parallel to the ship. So if the ship is pointing north and south, the yard is also pointing north and south. Most ships have anywhere from 1 to 3 yards per mast, and there are names for these yards, but we don't need to know what they are in order to understand what we're going to talk about here today. Some ships have a combination of the square and lateen rigging, and what this typically means is that the main mast and the foremast at the front are square-rigged, and the mizzen mast or rear mast is lateen-rigged. The reason I'm mentioning this is that some of this is going to come up when we talk about the different types of ships, because the rigging is one way to identify them. As you might imagine, the number of yards, sails, and the way they're configured have an effect on the ship's speed. We also want to talk about the sails. In a square-rigged ship, the sails are actually in the shape of a trapezoid, which means that they're wider at the bottom than they are at the top, where they are attached to the yard. On the lateen-rigged ships, the sail is usually triangular, and if you're having trouble picturing that, just picture a sailboat. On the other hand, in the movies like the Pirates of the Caribbean, the square-rigged ships are what you would typically see. One way that this affects the ship speed is that the square-rigged ships do pretty well in the open ocean because the wind speed is usually fairly constant, or at least it is more so than it is closer to shore. The direction is also fairly constant, again, as it compares to being closer to shore. When you are closer to shore, the lateen rigging allows the sailors to change the sail more quickly to take advantage of the wind speed and wind direction. This greater adjustment allows better maneuverability and can actually make the lateen-rigged ships sail faster when they're closer to shore compared to a ship that is exclusively square-rigged. By the way, if you'd like more stuff to help with world building, my artofworldbuilding.com site has a bunch of free templates that you can download by joining the mailing list. You can click the link in the episode description or the little information button in the upper right-hand corner. There are over 20 of these templates, as you can see from this list. Most of them are Microsoft Word documents, but the 2 calculator ones, which come from my Creating Places book, are Excel spreadsheets that take care of the math for you. You can just type in measurements from a map and find out how long it takes to go somewhere by dragon, wagon, foot, or even ships. If you're enjoying the video, remember to click the like button and subscribe. It's time to talk about ship rates. And I don't mean, hey, that's a first-rate ship or a third-rate ship, in the sense that the first rate is a really good one and the third rate is a kind of mediocre one. That's not what we mean by ship rates. The ratings are not a judgment of quality. It's really just about the number of guns and personnel. We're going to talk about this later, but we may not want guns and gunpowder and therefore cannons on our world, and we might want to have a replacement for them with something that is plausible. But for the sake of this conversation about ship rates, we're just going to talk about what the British Navy does, and of course they have cannons. I've got a handy little chart that includes the officers, seamen, and boys, and servants and the count of men who are aboard. A first-rate ship is going to have somewhere between 100 and 112 guns and 841 men. These are the biggest ships. By contrast, a sixth-rated ship, which is the lowest, is going to have somewhere between 20 and 28 guns and 128 to 198 men. In between those extremes, we have the second, third, fourth, and fifth-rate ships. Anything that had fewer than 20 guns, which is the sixth-rate ship, was not considered a rated ship. All of the ships on this chart had 3 masts. The 2 biggest classes, the first and second-rated ships, have 3 full decks just for the guns, which is a lot of firepower. That means they were carrying as few as 90 guns and as many as 112. The third and fourth rate ships had 2 gun decks, and the fifth and sixth rated ships had only 1 gun deck. So the first and second have 3, the third and fourth have 2, and the fifth and sixth have only 1 deck devoted solely to guns. For any ship that had more than 1 gun deck, the biggest guns were on the bottom because you don't want them on the top, since that would make the ship top-heavy and more likely to overturn. By the way, I founded Worldbuilding University, and you can browse the course selection to see if I've uploaded a course you might like. The link is below in the description. Also, and this is important, if you subscribe to my newsletter, I give out coupon codes for courses, including one to get the Accelerated Worldbuilding course for free. It's normally $49. I may put a coupon code in the episode description here, but I can't promise to keep up with that every month. Check it out at worldbuilding.university. Let's talk the ship types. As world builders, we could invent our own, but I don't think we need to because people are not sick of the ones that already exist. Now, vessels come in 2 basic groups, the long ships and the round ships. The round ships are not actually circular, of course, but they are called that because they are wide when compared to the narrow and streamlined long ships like those that the Vikings used. And as it turns out, we're only going to talk about one long ship, and that's called the galley. The long ships are the earliest types of ships, and all of them were basically designed for war or fast transportation, not carrying cargo. They were usually powered by oars, but they would have maybe 1 sail for additional propulsion at times. The galley is synonymous with Vikings, although it was used elsewhere. It usually had a single mast for that sail, and it had a metal prow at the front, so it could ram another boat and board it. While it's usually quite maneuverable, it has a really wide turning arc and it requires calm weather. While it can be used to go on the open seas, it wasn't typically used that way. It was mostly found along the shoreline. The invention of guns and the addition of cannons to bigger ships is one of the reasons why this kind of ship fell out of favor. So if your world doesn't have that kind of firepower, the galley might be one of the more commonly seen vessels. Some of these could be quite large and have a forecastle and a rear castle for artillery and soldiers, and as many as 25 oars on either side, each oar being rowed by 5 men. However, that is not the kind of ship that's being used for war. If it is in war, it's leading the vanguard. This is where the captain of a fleet of galleys would be. By the way, I'd love some support on Patreon. If you have even $1 to spare every month, you can help me cover costs and just send me some financial love. I have lots of cool stuff in there, including transcripts, stuff from my books, and MP3s from my albums and videos, since I'm also a musician. Check it out. The link is in the episode description. And if you choose to donate, you are awesome, and thank you so much for your support. Let's talk about the round ships. They were originally designed for carrying cargo and passengers, but of course they have been used for war. This is pretty much what you've seen in every pirate movie. Unless I say otherwise, all of the ships we're going to talk about are square-rigged on all of the masts. You may have heard the term man-of-war, but that is not a ship type. It's just a generic English name for any three-masted warship that has soldiers and cannons. Two examples of a man-of-war are the frigate and ship of the line, but those are two different ship types. This chart lists out the different types of ships and how many guns they have, how many crew, the maximum speed in knots, and their total length. The ships we're going to look at are the brig, frigate, galleon, gunboat, ship of the line, sloop, and sloop of war. All of them have a maximum speed of roughly 11 knots, though the frigate and gunboat could go up to 14 knots. First, we're going to talk about the brig, which is a two-masted square-rigged ship that has a single gun deck. This ship is really fast, highly maneuverable, and it can be used as a merchant ship, warship, or a scouting vessel. Pirates really like these because of all of these factors. The frigate is also fast and highly maneuverable, and it is a 4th or 5th rated ship with one gun deck. They are often used as scouting vessels for a fleet, escorting something, patrolling, or even acting independently. In fact, these are the largest ships that worked independently because the bigger ships were considered too valuable to risk being captured or destroyed. This is something that's obviously more likely to happen if a ship is traveling alone. There is something known as a heavy frigate, and that means a frigate that has 2 gun decks instead of only 1. They are the same length as bigger ships, like the ships of the line, but they have so little firepower by comparison to those that they would typically just run away from such a vessel. Otherwise, they would almost literally get blown out of the water. We'll talk more about ships of the line in a minute, but during a line of battle where there's a row of ships on one side and then the enemies also got a row of ships on the other, the frigates were not part of that ship of the line configuration, and that's why they're not called ships of the line. The frigates were present, but they were typically behind the line. The reason is that they were there to relay signals from one ship to another. Imagine if you're the last ship in a ship of the line configuration, all you see is the ship in front of you. You can't communicate to anything that's farther along. Therefore, you would communicate to a frigate which was off to one side, and that frigate would relay signals farther up the line. The rules of engagement also dictated that these ships were not actually fired upon unless the frigate had fired upon another ship first. Let's talk about the fire ship, which is an interesting variation. This is not a type of ship because any type of ship can be turned into a fire ship. This kind is designed to be set on fire and then sent into the enemy line of ships to hopefully catch other ships on fire. This obviously means certain destruction to the fire ship itself, and therefore valuable ships like a ship of the line were not used for such a vessel. Another ship type is the galleon, which has 2 features that distinguish it from other ship types. That is the mast and the prow at the front of the ship. The prow just has a distinguishable look to it, like a beak. Another way to spot this ship is that the center mast and the foremast at the front are square-rigged like all the other round ships that we're talking about, but the mizzen mast, the one at the rear, is lateen-rigged. This allows for a better point of sailing. As a result, this galleon could actually save days or even weeks on a long voyage over the open ocean. In other words, it would leave behind other ships that were pursuing it. Then there's the gunboat, which we may have to rename if we don't have guns in our world. But this boat is really small and it usually only has 1 or 2 cannons on it. It's designed to be used in coastal waters and take on large ships where it's easily outmatched, but if you have a dozen of these, they can do horrific damage to a larger ship just by surrounding it and blowing holes in it. These are cheap and easily replaced. On the opposite extreme is the ship of the line. This is a ship with at least 60 guns. This includes all 1st, 2nd, and 3rd rate ships. They get their name because of the configuration where they sail on a straight line, firing at a parallel line of the enemy's ships. The reasons both sides do this is so that they don't accidentally hit their own ships. The 1st-rate ships of the line are the biggest ships on the sea. On the opposite extreme is the sloop, which for most of us just means a sailboat. This is too small to be a ship of the line, and it's really only something we're going to use if our characters need a small, wind-powered vessel to get from one place to another. If we would like them to use oars instead of a sail and the wind, then we might have them use the galley, which was the longship that we talked about first. The sloop is not to be confused with the sloop of war, which is also called a corvette, kind of like the car. As the name implies, this is a warship that has a single gun deck with 18 guns. These are not rated ships because they only have 18 guns, and that does not meet the minimum requirement of 20 in the British system. But of course we can invent our own system and maybe call these 7th rated ships. The sloop of war has all sorts of different sail configurations, not just the square-rigged one. Now we'll talk about a privateer, but this is not really a ship type. Any ship that is operated by a private individual or a group of them for profit is considered a privateer. A sovereign power would give something known as a letter of marque to the captain of the ship, and that authorized this captain to engage in acts of war against other ships. Anytime it got the loot from this, a certain percentage of that captured prize was supposed to go to the sovereign power. If you're thinking this sounds a lot like piracy, well, it basically is. The difference between a privateer and a pirate is that letter of marque authorizing what they are doing. One of the cool things about this is that here on Earth in our history, we had people who had one of these letters that would basically absolve them of their actions, and they would sometimes get a letter of marque from another country, like France and Spain. They would justify the attacks on Spanish ships with a letter of marque from France, and then do the exact opposite. This was illegal, and of course they didn't tell either country that they were doing this. And of course some of them got caught, and they were accused of being pirates and punished accordingly because they had violated the idea of being a privateer by playing two sides against each other. Some countries also refused to recognize the letter of marque from their enemies, and then they would just hang the privateers as pirates. Sometimes they only threatened to do so as a way of extorting an exchange of prisoners or something else. Anything larger than a frigate was not typically used for this because it was considered unsuitable, so therefore there wouldn't be many ships of the line being used as privateers. By the way, this YouTube channel is based on my best-selling book series, The Art of Worldbuilding, so if you'd like all this advice written down somewhere, it already is. There's also more detail on everything we're talking about in the books, which are available in ebook, paperback, hardback, and audiobook. They can be found at many libraries, bookstores, and most online retailers like Amazon. Just click the links in the episode description. There's also another book related to the series called 185 Tips on Worldbuilding. The content is drawn from all 3 volumes, and this book is usually free as an ebook on Amazon and at other retailers, or sometimes it's only 99 cents. Let's talk about ship speeds. The first one we're going to talk about is when people are using oars, because this is pretty straightforward. The top speed doesn't really matter because people can't keep doing that for very long. If there is a favorable wind, a ship can do about 2 to 3 knots. With an unfavorable wind, it's about half of that, or 1 knot to 1.5 knots. Earlier I said that many of the wind-powered ships can reach 11 knots at their maximum speed, so you can see this is pretty slow by comparison. And now comes the harder part, which is trying to figure out how fast ships can travel by sail. We should keep in mind that during a coastline-hugging trip, the ship will dock for the night in a port if it is able to. This is going to slow down the trip a little bit, of course, because they are not actually sailing for however many hours they are docked. By contrast, when sailing over the open ocean, a ship will have enough crew that they can sail continuously. I have some calculations that we're going to use. These are going to be kept relatively simple. They are also going to be done in miles. Speed is measured in knots. A knot is 1 nautical mile per hour. That means that a nautical mile is 1.151 land miles. If you're wondering why there's a difference, well, the nautical mile accounts for the curvature of the Earth, while the land mile does not. That's mostly a piece of trivia that you can surprise your friends with. What this really means for us is that if we've decided the distance between 2 ports on the coast is 77 miles apart by land, we would have to divide that number by 1.151 to learn how many nautical miles it would be. In this case, that would be 67 miles. Whether we measure in miles or kilometers has no effect on the time that the trip takes. Let's look at an example. If we had 77 miles, we would divide that by 1.151 to get 67 nautical miles. Traveling at 6 knots, we would take the 67 nautical miles, divide that by 6 knots to get roughly 11 hours of continuous sailing. At 4 knots, it would take 17 hours, and at 2 knots, it would take 33.5 hours. So it's really not as hard as it seems. I do have a number of other subjects that are discussed in the book Creating Places, but the last one we're going to talk about today is the one of weaponry. If we've decided that there is no gunpowder, guns, or cannons in our world, that means that the ships have no firepower. Therefore, there is really no drama to these. So the question is, what can we use as an alternative? Before we talk about that, we should probably understand what the cannon is, how it works, and how many people are needed to fire that. So let's take a closer look. The largest cannon typically found on a ship in the age of sail is a 36-pounder, which means it fires a cannonball weighing 36 pounds. This cannon took 14 guys to operate. One of these is a powder boy who goes and gets the gunpowder. That role could be eliminated if we don't have cannons. One thing that this means is that if we don't have 100 cannons, then we have 100 fewer crew because we don't need those 100 powder boys. The number of crews might be reduced when we reduce the number of people needed to operate a weapon that is going to replace our cannon. We may not ever want to mention this, but it's something to keep in mind. There's also a chief gunner who is responsible for priming the cannon for firing, but he's not actually the one who fires it. But this role is the one who is in charge of the crew. The rest of them are just called gunners. There's a sequence that I describe in the book, but I'm not going to go into here, but it basically involves prepping the cannon for firing, actually firing it, and then re-prepping it. One issue with the cannon is that there is tremendous recoil, which means the cannon flies backward away from the edge of the ship, or the hull. Therefore, it has to be forcibly moved back into position by all of those gunners. This is one reason why there are so many crew for these really large cannons. So if we don't have a cannon, then what can we use? I did a lot of research into this, and the only thing that I could find that really makes sense is the ballista, which is basically a giant crossbow. If you use something like a catapult, well, that has a motion that is going to interfere with the rigging because there are all those ropes holding the sails. The ballista is one of the few things that has a firing motion that's similar to a cannon, and you could actually have it inside the hull. Granted, a ship might have to be built slightly different to accommodate these, but it still could fit in there and fire through a hole just like a cannon. The big question here is how much firepower and range does that really have? The Roman ballista could fire over 500 yards, and it was made of wood. But if we were to make ours out of iron and have metal for the arms, that could give us even greater power. We might also have a fictional alloy of greater strength, like adamantine, which can make it even more powerful. Such a fictional alloy could produce a range that is greater than the Roman ballista. A 12-pound cannon could fire 1,500 yards. While the practical range was a lot less, we can certainly claim something similar for our new ballista. Being plausible is the bar we need to get over. As far as firepower, a ballista is strong enough to fire straight through an armored knight and pin him to a living tree. We're talking about the real ballista here, not the fictional one that we could invent. Obviously, one could blow a hole in the side of a ship, especially when the wood is not from a living tree, because a living tree is much stronger wood than any wood that came from one. In the book, I go into some other details like how many people you might need to fire one of these, but I'm not going to cover that here. I'm also not going to cover how fast one of these could fire, but I'm just giving you this basic idea of something that you could use to replace a cannon with. Either you do some research on your own, or you can pick up a copy of Creating Places and read what I came up with. Alright, that's all for today's episode. Please remember to like the video and subscribe. As always, there's more info in the book that this is based on, which is Creating Places from the Art of Worldbuilding book series. You can find a link to it in the description below. There's also a link to the free book, Another for Worldbuilding University, and the newsletter sign-up link that will net you over 20 templates you can use throughout your hobby or career as an author or game designer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.